Alfred Packer was 32 years old when he came through the door of the Los Pinos Indian Agency on the morning of April 16, 1874. He had been in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado for 66 days. The men at the agency were sitting down to breakfast when he appeared, and they gave him a place at the table. 5 other men had gone into those mountains with him in February. None of them came out. The agency staff noted what they saw. Packer's face was bloated. His body was not skeletal. He could not keep solid food down, and his stomach, he explained, had been altered by weeks of near starvation. He drank whiskey instead. He told them his companions had abandoned him after he fell ill. Israel Swan, the oldest man in the party, had pressed a rifle into his hands before the others walked away. After that, he had survived alone on rosebuds and roots, working his way down through the snow until he saw the agency buildings from the top of a hill. He still had the rifle. He also had a steel coffee pot with burning embers inside it. The coals kept alive across 66 days because, he said, he had run out of matches weeks before. The men at the agency fed him what he could take. Charles Adams, the agent in charge, wrote later that Packer arrived evidently in good health and condition. The description did not fit a man who had nearly starved. He stayed 10 days. Then he headed to Saguache, the nearest town of any size, saying he intended to make his way back to Pennsylvania. He said he was broke. He sold the rifle for $10 before he left. Preston Nutter had been part of the larger expedition that left Utah the previous fall. He had stayed behind at Chief Ouray's winter camp when Packer's group pushed on into the mountains, and he had come through the winter without difficulty. By the time he reached Saguache in the spring of 1874, Packer had been there for weeks. Nutter found him at Dolan's saloon. Packer was at the bar, spending freely. According to Larry Dolan, the saloon owner, Packer had run through around $100 during his stay and had offered to lend Dolan $300 more. He had bought a horse for $70, a new saddle on top of that. When Nutter asked where the money had come from, Packer said someone in town had given him a loan. No one in Saguache recalled the transaction. Then Nutter looked at what Packer was carrying. The skinning knife at his belt had belonged to Frank Miller, one of the 5 men who had not come down from the mountains. Packer said Miller had stuck it in a tree and walked away without it. The Winchester rifle Packer had brought into the agency and since sold for $10 had belonged to Israel Swan. A pipe he had left behind at the agency had belonged to Shannon Bell. Nutter later testified about his impression of Packer during those weeks in Saguache. He called him sulky, obstinate, and quarrelsome, a man willing to take things that did not belong to him, whether they had any value or not. The 2 men argued in the street. They were separated before it became something worse. Packer continued preparing to leave. He did not leave. A few days later, he was escorted back to the agency. Israel Swan was the oldest. He was around 65, according to the family who would testify at trial, a man who had set out for the Colorado gold country, carrying somewhere between $2,000 and $6,000 in cash and gold, depending on which account you credited. His family said $6,000. Packer, in his first confession, said $2,000. Both agreed the money existed. Swan also had a Winchester rifle, which he was known to have brought with him into the mountains. He gave neither the rifle nor the money to anyone. When Packer came out of those mountains, he had the rifle. Shannon Wilson Bell was red-haired. That detail appears in the first physical account of the campsite, noted by the men who went to look at what remained of the party months later. He was the last of the 5 to die, by all the evidence eventually gathered. That is nearly everything the record gives about him as a man. George Noon went by the name California, which suggests something about where he had come from or where he had hoped to go, though the sources do not say which. He was a teenager, the youngest person in that group of 6. The historical record gives him a nickname and an age bracket, and nothing more. Frank Miller had worked as a butcher, and the name had followed him. He had quarreled with Packer from the early weeks of the expedition, repeatedly and openly. His knife was in Packer's possession in Saguache. James Humphrey carried $133. That figure appears in Packer's own words, in his first official statement, because Packer said he found Humphrey's wallet and took the money. Humphrey does not appear in the record any other way. 5 men walked into the San Juan Mountains in the first days of February 1874. They left no letters, no family accounts of their departure. The documents of this case run to hundreds of pages on Alfred Packer. His confessions, his trials, his letters from prison, the forensic analysis of his revolver, conducted a century after the fact. Swan, Bell, Miller, Humphrey, and Noon are present in those pages almost entirely through what Packer carried out of the mountains with him. On what Agent Adams's records place in early April, 2 Ute men ran into the Los Pinos agency holding something. They had found it on the hillside above the agency, lying in the snow, preserved by the cold. They called it white man's meat. When the strips of flesh were brought before Packer, the color left his face. He sank. The agency staff administered restoratives. When he could speak, he said he wanted mercy, and then he began to talk. What came out was his first account of what happened in those mountains. The 6 men had left Chief Ouray's camp in February with what they believed was enough food for a 14-day journey. The food went faster than expected. They dug roots from the frozen ground and found no game. After some days, Packer returned to camp from gathering firewood to find Israel Swan dead, struck in the head, and the other 4 men already beginning to butcher the body. Swan's money was divided among the survivors. Miller was killed next, struck with a hatchet as he bent to pick up wood. Then Humphrey, then Noon. Packer and Bell made a pact that they would not harm each other, and Bell broke it. He rushed at Packer with a rifle. Packer killed him with a hatchet. He had cut Bell's flesh into strips and carried it with him toward the agency. When he saw the buildings from the ridge, he threw the strips away. He admitted, in his own words, that he did so reluctantly, that he had grown fond of human flesh, especially the portion around the breast. Agent Adams took his statement and turned him over to the local sheriff. On May 4, 1874, Charles Adams sent his regular monthly report to Edward Smith, the Commissioner of the Office of Indian Affairs. Schools, road construction, a land dispute on the reservation boundary. 5 days later, he sent a second letter, separate from the routine correspondence. In it, Adams described the winter storm that had driven 21 Utah miners to Chief Ouray's camp, the warnings Ouray had given before Packer's group departed, and Packer's arrival at the agency on April 14th, alone and in better health than the journey warranted. He described the discovery of the flesh on the snow, Packer's confession, and his own decision to hand the matter to the local magistrate. He closed with a brief note about the men who had stayed with Ouray through the winter. They had arrived at the agency that same month, well cared for, having suffered comparatively very little. His characterization of Packer in the weeks following the confession was precise. Mr. Packer, he wrote, looked quite fat when he arrived, and had since shown traces of mental aberration, which was said to be the consequence of eating human flesh. Commissioner Smith received the letter. He wrote back to Adams twice in the following weeks. The first letter informed Adams that a man named Henry Bond had been appointed to replace him as agent. The second concerned a visiting engineer from the Army Corps. Neither letter mentioned Alfred Packer or the 5 dead men. That summer, John Randolph was working a field assignment for Harper's Weekly in the Colorado High Country, sketching along the lake shores near Lake City. He was not looking for anything in particular when he found them. All 5 bodies were there, in a pine-shaded gulch 2 miles southeast of town, above the lake fork of the Gunnison River. Together, not scattered across miles of mountain terrain as Packer's account had required, with one man dying here and another there as the survivors pressed on. All 5, in a single camp, as though none of them had moved again after arriving. Randolph sketched what he saw before walking into Lake City to report it. The Hinsdale County coroner assembled roughly 20 men and returned to the site. One of the 5 appeared to have struggled before death. The others had not. A rifle, broken in 2, lay near the bodies. A short distance away stood a crude shelter. A path, worn by repeated use, ran from the shelter to where the 5 men lay. Inside the shelter were blankets and belongings that had been carried into those mountains by men who were now in the ground outside. Randolph's illustration ran in Harper's Weekly on October 17, 1874. The story reached readers across the country. Back in Saguache, the sheriff went to confront Packer with what had been found. Alfred Packer was gone. The coroner's account from 1874 noted one thing the bodies could settle, and many things they could not. Israel Swan, the prosecution would argue at trial, had put up a fight before he died. The marks on his remains were different from those on the others. Packer's first confession had Swan dying first, struck down by the group, while Packer was away gathering wood. If Swan had fought, he had fought someone in a camp where 5 men had come to rest together, rather than strung out across miles of mountain trail. The order of the other deaths remained unclear, whether Packer had acted alone or alongside any of the others. Before the end, the physical record left after 4 months of mountain weather and scavenging animals could not determine. The broken rifle near the bodies was consistent with any number of accounts. The worn path between the bodies and Packer's shelter told one thing plainly. Someone had made that walk more than once. In the weeks between the last death and the day Packer came down to the agency. He escaped from the jail in Saguache sometime in the fall of 1874. The jail was a log cabin on the county sheriff's property, and Saguache County had been housing Packer for months without formal charges beyond the attempted assault on the agency clerk. One account says a makeshift key was passed to him through the bars. Packer never said by whom or what arrangement had been made. He was simply gone one morning. For 9 years he moved through the West as John Schwartza. Arizona, Montana, Wyoming, the record of those years is thin, the ordinary paper trail of a man who needed not to be found. By March of 1883, he was in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and he had been there long enough to be recognized. Jean Cabazon, a Frenchman who had been part of the original Utah expedition and had stayed behind at Urey's camp rather than follow Packer into the mountains, came across him by chance. The sources disagree on the exact location. One account says Fort Fetterman, another says Cheyenne. What they agree on is how Cabazon knew him. Not by his face, by his voice. He reported what he knew to the local sheriff, who made the arrest. Packer was transported to Denver. On March 16, 1883, he sat down and signed his name to a second official statement. The account Packer signed in Denver in March 1883 was a different kind of document from the one extracted from him at the agency 9 years before. That first statement had come out under immediate pressure, in pieces, full of details the physical record had since contradicted. This one arrived after 9 years of distance from the events, 9 years without a formal charge, 9 years in which the only version of what happened in those mountains was his own. In this version, Packer had not been present for most of what happened. He had left the camp to look for a trail, walking for most of a day through snow that came up past his knees. He returned toward evening. The fire was still going. Shannon Bell, the red-haired man, was sitting beside it, roasting a piece of meat he had cut from the leg of Frank Miller. Miller's body lay downstream, skull crushed by a hatchet. The other 3 men were near the fire, each struck in the forehead. Packer wrote that he came within a rod of the fire before Bell saw him. Bell stood and came at him with the hatchet. Packer shot him through the side of the body. Bell fell. Packer picked up the hatchet and struck him in the top of the head. After that, he said, a storm closed in. He built a shelter and stayed in it, unable to travel, for the better part of 60 days. He ate what was available. He made it out when the weather broke. General Adams, who had traveled to Denver to take the statement, asked him why he had not told this story 9 years earlier, at the agency, when it might have mattered. Packer's answer was recorded. I was excited. I wanted to say something, and the story, as I told it, came first to my mind. What the science would eventually do with this account is taken up later. What the jury did with it came first. The first trial opened in Lake City on April 6, 1883, in a 2-story courthouse on Silver Street that also served as the county's administrative building. The prosecution's argument was direct. No guide leads 5 men into the San Juan Mountains in February with barely enough food for 2 weeks and no snowshoes, unless he does not expect them to need more. Packer pleaded not guilty. He took the stand and gave substantially the same account he had signed in Denver, insisting that Bell had killed the other 4 and that he himself had acted in self-defense. On April 13th, after 7 days of testimony, the jury found him guilty of the premeditated murder of Israel Swan and sentenced him to hang on May 19. The jury in Lake City was composed entirely of Democrats. The hanging did not take place. Packer's attorneys discovered that the murder statutes in force during 1874 had been repealed when Colorado became a state in 1876, without a clause preserving their application to crimes already committed. The Colorado Supreme Court overturned the conviction in October 1885. A second trial was held in Gunnison the following year, moved there after Packer's counsel argued that Lake City's political composition made impartiality unlikely. The charges came down to 5 counts of voluntary manslaughter. On June 8, 1886, he was convicted on all 5 and sentenced to 8 years per count, to run consecutively. 40 years in total. It was the longest custodial sentence in the United States at that time. He was sent to the state penitentiary at Cannon City and filed appeals 5 times over the years that followed. Each was denied. On July 17, 1989, 115 years after the deaths near Lake City, James Starrs and his team from George Washington University located the burial site. A local surgeon owned the house at the end of whose driveway the 5 men had lain since 1874, 13 inches below the surface of the ground. The examination took several weeks. What the soil had preserved was enough to draw some conclusions, and not enough to draw others. All 5 skulls showed damage consistent with blunt force. 3 of the skeletons, Shannon Bell's among them, had marks across the forearm bones that forensic analysis identified as defensive, the kind left when a person raises his arms against a blow coming down. 2 skeletons had cylindrical puncture wounds in the pelvic region. Whether those came from an animal or from a bullet, the analysis could not say with certainty. A separate investigation, begun in 1994 by David Bailey at the Museum of Western Colorado, eventually connected a Colt revolver in the museum's collection to the crime scene. In 2001, Dr. Richard Duget at Mesa State College examined microscopic lead fragments recovered from the soil beneath Bell's remains and matched them by spectrograph to the bullets still in the revolver. Bell had been shot. A Civil War veteran who had visited the original site in 1874 had stated at the time that Bell showed a bullet wound to the pelvis and that his wallet had a bullet hole through it. The spectrographic match gave that account a physical foundation, 127 years after the fact. What the science could not determine was who had killed the other 4, or in what order, or whether anything in the camp that winter had resembled the account Packer signed in Denver. Starrs concluded that Packer more than likely murdered his companions. He acknowledged he could not prove it. The 5 men were reinterred when the examination was complete. Funeral rites were read. It was the first formal burial any of them had received. Alfred Packer was paroled on February 8, 1901, after serving 18 years of his 40-year sentence. He had not secured his release through the courts. He had secured it through the newspapers. Leonel Ross O'Brien, who wrote for the Denver Post under the name Polly Pry, had taken up his case in the late 1890s. She found the frame the legal system had never offered him, a Union Army veteran discharged for illness, who had done what he had to do to survive a Colorado winter, and had been paying for it ever since. She ran his letters in the paper. She organized the petition campaign that reached the desk of Governor Charles Thomas as he was preparing to leave office. His last official act as governor was to parole Alfred Packer, on the condition that Packer not profit from his story. Packer went to work as a security guard at the Denver Post. He called Polly Pry his liberator for the rest of his life. He spent his final years in and around Littleton, on Harrison Avenue, and later on West Hampton, and at the end on a ranch in Deer Creek Canyon, about 12 miles from town. The neighbors described him as a kindly man who would take children onto his knee and tell them stories about the Old West. He died on April 23, 1907. The recorded cause was dementia, trouble, and worry. Because he had served in the Union Army, the federal government paid for the funeral and provided the headstone. It stands in the Littleton Cemetery, Lot 65. It reads, Alfred Packer, Co. F. 16 U.S. Inf. His last recorded words, reported by the Littleton Independent, were, "I'm not guilty of the charge." The 5 men he had traveled with in the winter of 1874 received a proper burial in 1989. Their names are on a marker near Lake City. Israel Swan, Shannon Wilson Bell, Frank Miller, James Humphrey, George Noon. The marker gives the year of their deaths.